Why is the groom kneeling before the maid? Marianne.
There are moments in life where everything you thought you understood about a person crumbles in the space of a single second, where a small action, barely noticeable to most people watching, reveals a truth so profound that it changes not just the direction of one day, but the trajectory of multiple lives forever. This is a story about exactly that moment. It is the story of a wedding that should have gone perfectly, a ceremony that had been planned for 8 months with military precision, attended by 200 guests, with every detail orchestrated to impress a family that the bride's mother had spent her entire adult life trying to gain acceptance from. But none of that mattered when Diane Calloway's hand rose in anger, and none of it would ever be the same again. What happened in that garden outside Charleston in May was not just a slap. It was the culmination of years of hidden cruelty, years of small humiliations disguised as corrections, years of a woman named Sophia Reyes absorbing the weight of another family's ambitions without complaint, without resistance, and without anyone truly understanding the depth of her dignity or the true reason why a groom would walk away from his own altar to kneel beside a maid in front of everyone who mattered. This is the story of what happens when a family's deepest secrets are revealed in front of 200 witnesses, and why the woman everyone thought they knew turned out to be someone entirely different. Before we go any further into how this all began, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sophia Reyes had been working inside the Calloway household for 8 years, since she was 19 years old, following a path her own mother had walked decades earlier, serving the same family, cleaning the same rooms, absorbing the same quiet indifference that comes with a life spent making other people's lives run smoothly behind the scenes. Her mother had worked for the Calloways for 20 years before Sophia arrived, and when her mother passed away 3 years into Sophia's own employment, the family offered their condolences with the kind of practiced sympathy they extended to all things that mildly inconvenienced them, before moving on to the next item on their agenda. Sophia returned to work within a month because she needed the income, and because some part of her felt obligated to finish what her mother had started, though she could never quite articulate why that obligation felt so important to her, so non-negotiable, even when her older brother Marcus questioned the wisdom of staying. Grace Calloway, the family's daughter, had always been different from the rest of her family in ways that went deeper than personality or preference. She possessed a genuine warmth that seemed almost out of place in a household built on careful image management and social climbing. A warmth that expressed itself most freely with Sophia, the woman who had essentially raised her after her own mother proved too distracted by appearances to manage the practical work of actually raising a child. By the time Grace turned 28, she and Sophia had developed a friendship that went far beyond the typical employer-employee relationship, though both of them understood that this friendship existed in a carefully protected space, away from Diane Calloway's scrutiny, away from the formal rules that governed the rest of the household. They would talk in the kitchen on quiet evenings, after the rest of the family had retired, and Grace would confide in Sophia in ways she could never confide in her own mother, trusting Sophia with worries about her future, her relationships, her fundamental uncertainty about whether she was actually living her own life or simply performing the version of life her mother had scripted for her. What no one in that house understood, because Sophia had deliberately kept this part of her life sealed off from their world, was that she was quietly working toward a degree in business administration, studying most nights after the Calloways had gone to sleep, her laptop balanced on her knees in the small apartment she shared with Marcus, an apartment in a different neighborhood entirely. An apartment that represented Sophia's actual life as opposed to the life she lived within those walls. The degree was now in its final stages, just 2 semesters remaining, and Sophia had begun allowing herself to imagine a future that extended beyond domestic service. A future where she controlled her own income and her own time and her own decisions. She had told no one in the Calloway household about this pursuit, not even Grace, because some instinct warned her that Diane Calloway would find a way to weaponize this ambition against her, would see it as evidence of ingratitude or disloyalty or some other failing that existed primarily in Diane's own interpretation of events. There was one other detail that Sophia kept buried, one that she herself barely understood the full implications of, a detail that caused a small but visible reaction whenever anyone in the house mentioned the Hamptons or spoke the name Eleanor Hale. A flicker would cross Sophia's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, a tightening around her eyes that had nothing to do with the conversation at hand, a reaction that suggested the name meant something personal, something connected to her past, something she had made a deliberate choice not to discuss. No one in the Calloway household noticed this reaction because no one in the Calloway household paid close enough attention to Sophia to notice anything about her beyond what she was currently doing for them. It was a small, private defense, a way of protecting a part of her history that belonged only to her and to her mother, a story that had been told to her only in fragments, late at night, followed by a request that Sophia never bring it up again, never ask questions about it, never acknowledge that part of her mother's life had existed at all. The engagement announcement came in early autumn, arriving like an earthquake that reshaped the entire foundation of the Calloway household. Nathaniel Hale had proposed to Grace during a weekend trip to Savannah, and when Grace returned home wearing a ring that cost more than Sophia's entire annual salary, Diane Calloway underwent a transformation so complete that she seemed like a different person entirely. The woman who had spent years indifferent to most details of her daughter's life suddenly became obsessed with every aspect of wedding planning, consumed by an urgent need to orchestrate something so perfectly, so impressively, that it would finally earn her a place of genuine respect within the world of the Hale family. A family whose name carried weight in rooms Diane had spent her entire adult life trying to penetrate. Sophia was assigned to work as Grace's personal attendant during the entire wedding planning process, a decision made not out of generosity but pure convenience, since Sophia already knew Grace's preferences, habits, and anxieties better than any professional wedding planner could possibly learn in the span of months. The arrangement meant that Sophia spent more concentrated hours with Grace over those 8 months than anyone else in the entire family did, accompanying her to dress fittings, sitting through endless tastings and venue consultations, driving her to appointments, and most importantly, listening to Grace articulate her deepest concerns about the massive life change she was about to undertake. Grace confided in Sophia about her anxieties regarding Nathaniel, her uncertainty about whether she was making the right decision, her fear that she was losing herself in the process of becoming part of a family she barely knew and whose expectations she struggled to understand. Sophia provided the same steady, unhurried presence she had always provided, offering companionship rather than judgment, support rather than advice, and Grace seemed to need that steadiness far more than she needed anyone else's opinion or approval. Nathaniel Hale himself first met Sophia properly during one of these dress fittings in October, when Grace introduced her simply as the woman who had essentially raised her, a comment that caused Diane's smile to tighten visibly, as though Grace had just revealed something embarrassing about her own childhood that should have remained private. Nathaniel shook Sophia's hand with warmth and directness, thanked her for everything Grace had told him about the role she played in keeping the household running smoothly, and displayed a kind of genuine interest in Sophia as a person rather than as an employee or service provider. This small gesture of basic human recognition seemed to unsettle Diane more than almost anything else that happened during the planning process, and she quickly redirected the conversation towards seating charts and guest lists, uncomfortable with Nathaniel's evident respect for someone she had trained herself to regard as essentially invisible. It was during this same visit that Nathaniel mentioned something almost in passing, a detail that seemed insignificant at the time, but that would prove to carry enormous weight later in the story. He told Grace that his grandmother Eleanor, the family's matriarch, rarely left her estate anymore, her health limiting her ability to travel and participate in family events. However, he continued, she had specifically and unusually insisted on attending this wedding, had been quite emphatic about it actually, though Nathaniel admitted he didn't fully understand her reasons for being so adamant about it. Grace assumed it was simply a matter of family tradition and the importance of major milestones, the kind of thing Eleanor would naturally consider important. Sophia said nothing, though something in her stomach tightened at the mention of the name, at the sound of Eleanor Hale being discussed in such an ordinary context, as though she were simply another guest rather than a name that held personal significance to Sophia's own family history, a name that evoked the same quiet unease that surfaced any time the Hamptons came up in conversation, a feeling that Sophia had learned to push down and not examine. By November, as the wedding date approached, the planning process had accelerated into something approaching controlled chaos, and Diane Calloway's temperament sharpened proportionally with the pressure. The household had begun to feel like a pressure cooker, with Diane making constant adjustments, changing decisions that had already been made, demanding perfection from everyone around her, and reserving her harshest criticism for the person she deemed most responsible for meeting those impossible standards. The incident that revealed the true depth of Diane's cruelty occurred on an ordinary Tuesday in November, when Diane changed the timing of an important vendor meeting with less than 2 hours' notice, a scheduling change she failed entirely to communicate to Sophia, meaning that when the wedding planner and vendors arrived at the appointed new time, they found no one prepared to meet with them, no one ready to discuss the final details they had come to finalize. The oversight was entirely Diane's responsibility, stemming from her own failure to communicate her own change of plans, but Diane's humiliation at being caught unprepared curdled instantly into fury, and that fury was directed not at herself, but at Sophia, delivered in front of both the wedding planner and the vendors in language carefully calibrated to sound like professional frustration rather than personal cruelty, a technique Diane had perfected over years of disguising her own failures as other people's incompetence. She accused Sophia of being unreliable, incompetent, fundamentally unable to perform even the simplest tasks, and she threatened her position outright, making clear that Sophia's job security depended entirely on flawless performance from this moment forward, that any further failures would result in her immediate termination. The message was unmistakable, the threat was real, and everyone in the room understood that Diane was willing to destroy Sophia's livelihood over a mistake that Diane herself had created. In the weeks that followed this discovery, Diane began implementing a deliberate strategy to isolate Sophia from Grace and from the wedding planning process itself. She found reasons to reassign Sophia to tasks that kept her physically and emotionally distant from the bride, creating errands that required her presence elsewhere, scheduling her work at times when Grace was not home, essentially removing her from the inner circle she had occupied for months. Grace noticed Sophia's sudden absence almost immediately, noticed that the steady presence she had relied on had been systematically withdrawn, and for the first time in her entire relationship with her mother, Grace directly confronted Diane about the reassignment, asking plainly and without accusation why Sophia had been removed from wedding preparations at the exact moment when Grace most needed her support and presence. Diane offered a vague answer about efficiency and operational necessity, language that satisfied no one, least of all Grace, who found herself, for the first time in her life, genuinely questioning her mother's motives and reasoning rather than simply accepting whatever explanations Diane offered. Nathaniel noticed Sophia's disappearance as well, though he had known her for far less time than Grace had. During a formal dinner in early January with both families, he asked Grace directly and with evident concern why Sophia seemed to have vanished from the wedding preparations she had been central to for months, why she had been replaced by wedding planners and consultants when Sophia had been doing that work with apparent competence all along. Grace found herself unable to provide a satisfactory answer, and the gap in her explanation, the fact that she couldn't explain or even fully understand why her mother had made this decision, sat uncomfortably between them for the remainder of the evening, creating the first significant tension in an engagement that had, until this moment, felt entirely solid and unshakable. For the first time, doubt had been introduced into a relationship that both of them had assumed would proceed smoothly toward marriage. Meanwhile, Sophia herself was facing a decision that would force her to choose between two competing versions of loyalty, two different ways of understanding what she owed to the people and relationships that mattered to her. Her older brother Marcus, who had been observing her situation at the Calloway house with increasing concern and frustration, finally approached her with a serious job offer in mid-January. His contracting firm had grown substantially over the past year, expanding its client base and increasing its operational complexity, and he needed someone with business acumen and organizational skills to manage the office side of the operation, someone he could trust, someone who understood both the practical and the interpersonal dimensions of running a growing business. The position would offer Sophia stable income substantially higher than what she was earning as a domestic employee. It would provide her with respectful working conditions and a defined schedule, and most importantly, it would offer her a way out of a household that was actively working to diminish her and control her opportunities. However, Marcus's offer came with a condition that made the decision genuinely impossible in the way that all truly impossible choices are impossible. He needed Sophia to start within 2 weeks, before the wedding took place, before Grace had her wedding day, before any of the plans Diane had spent 8 months constructing came to fruition. The timing made sense from a business perspective. The position had opened now and wouldn't wait through February for Sophia to finish out a wedding that had nothing to do with Marcus's company or its timeline. But from Sophia's perspective, leaving now meant abandoning Grace precisely when Grace needed her most, meant walking away from the one relationship inside that house that had ever felt genuine rather than transactional, meant perpetuating the pattern of people abandoning Grace to her mother's control, which was exactly what Sophia had always told herself she would never do. Sophia sat with the offer for 3 days, turning it over in her mind during the quiet hours after the Calloway house had gone dark, running through different scenarios, different ways of understanding the choice, different frameworks for deciding what she owed to different people. She thought about her mother, who had stayed in service to this family for 20 years out of a loyalty Sophia had never fully understood until this exact moment, standing at the same crossroads, facing the same impossible math of competing obligations and limited options. She thought about Marcus, who had been injured on a job site and was still carrying medical debt that Sophia quietly helped him manage, who was offering her an escape route and promising her a better life. She thought about Grace, who had shown her genuine kindness in a household built on indifference, who had confided in her when she had no one else to turn to, who needed her presence and support for the final weeks before the wedding. In the end, Sophia made the choice her mother would have made, the choice that prioritized loyalty to a relationship over protection of her own interests, the choice that cost her something real in exchange for something that might have been purely emotional. She told Marcus she would come after the wedding, told him she needed to see this through, told him that Grace needed her now, and that Sophia couldn't abandon someone in the moment they needed her most. Marcus didn't hide his disappointment, telling his sister plainly that she deserved better than a family that had never once, in the entire 8 years she had worked for them, treated her like she actually belonged in the room, that his disappointment in her choice was rooted in his absolute certainty that she was being taken for granted and that she was letting herself be exploited because of a loyalty the Callaways had never earned. Sophia didn't argue the point, didn't try to convince him that he was wrong, because she knew that in many ways he wasn't wrong. He was simply looking at the situation through a different lens, prioritizing different values than the ones Sophia had chosen to prioritize. She simply told him she needed to see this through, and he let it go, the way he always eventually did with his sister, trusting her judgment even when he disagreed with it, even when he worried that her choices were going to cost her something she couldn't get back. The wedding day arrived in late May, the kind of perfectly orchestrated afternoon that had consumed 8 months of Diane Calloway's complete attention and emotional energy, whether cooperating as though the universe itself had decided to bless this particular event with ideal conditions. The garden venue outside Charleston was filled with white roses arranged in formations that had taken a team of florists 2 full days to install, the kind of meticulous detail that existed primarily for the photographs, for the documentation that would allow Diane to relive and share this moment of social success for years to come. Sophia spent the morning exactly as she had spent every morning for the past 8 years, performing the role of invisible support, steaming the final creases from a dress she had pressed 3 nights running when everyone else in the house had gone to bed, helping Grace with the practical details of getting ready, doing the 1,000 small things that had to happen behind the scenes in order for the bride to appear flawless when the moment came to walk down the aisle. She held Grace's hand backstage when the nerves finally caught up with her in the final minutes before the ceremony began, when the reality of what was about to happen suddenly became visceral and overwhelming rather than abstract and theoretical. Grace's hands were shaking. Her breathing had become shallow. Her certainty had begun to crumble in the face of the actual magnitude of the commitment she was about to make in front of 200 witnesses. Sophia did what she had always done, provided steady presence, spoke in a calm voice about how brave Grace was being, reminded her of why she was making this choice, grounded her in the reality that Nathaniel loved her and that they had chosen this together and that everything was going to be okay. It was the role Sophia had played for Grace countless times over the years, and it was a role she played flawlessly, drawing on reserves of emotional stability and reassurance that seemed infinite. She adjusted the final details of Grace's dress, made sure the veil was positioned correctly, made sure every detail was perfect, and then she stepped back and watched as Grace took a breath and prepared to walk down the aisle and change her life forever. The stain that Diane discovered was small, barely noticeable except under very specific lighting conditions, a faint mark of red wine from the rehearsal dinner 2 nights earlier that had somehow made it through the multiple pressings and careful handling, a mark so subtle that no professional photographer would have caught it from more than 3 feet away, a mark that would have been invisible in any photograph that actually made it to print or was displayed publicly. But Diane had spent 8 months building toward a single flawless afternoon, orchestrating every detail to project an image of perfection and control, and in her mind, any deviation from that image, any possible flaw no matter how minor, represented a failure of the entire enterprise. All of the careful planning, all of the strategic relationship building with the Hale family, all of the performance of success that she had spent her entire adult life perfecting seemed to hang on the absence of a single wine stain on the hem of a wedding dress. In the space of 1 instant, all of that pressure collapsed into a single moment of humiliated rage, and Diane's hand rose and landed across Sophia's face in front of 200 guests, in front of the string quartet that had just finished playing, in front of her own daughter, standing frozen at the altar, before anyone, including Diane herself, fully registered what she had done or understood the consequences that would follow from this single moment of lost control. The sound of the slap seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed, a sound so sharp and unexpected in a garden full of people who had been trained by social convention to maintain certain standards of behavior and composure. No one moved immediately. No one spoke. The silence that followed was profound and complete, a silence that seemed to swallow all of the carefully orchestrated beauty of the garden, all of the perfect flowers and perfect lighting and perfect music, and replace it with something raw and real and shocking. Sophia did not cry out. She did not gasp or recoil or perform the emotional response that might have been expected from someone who had just been struck in front of 200 witnesses. She simply stood there, one hand slowly rising to her cheek, her expression shifting into something that can only be described as recognition, her eyes steady in a way that unsettled everyone who saw it, because it was not the reaction of someone who had just experienced shock. It was the reaction of someone who had been carrying something far heavier than a slap for a very long time. Someone who had absorbed versions of this moment many times before in smaller doses over many years, and who was finally watching it break the surface in front of witnesses who could not possibly deny that it had happened. Nathaniel Hale moved before anyone else in that garden had fully processed what had happened, before the social conventions that governed weddings and public behavior had had time to reassert themselves, before anyone could smooth over the moment with apologies or explanations or attempts to minimize the severity of what had just occurred. He walked down from the altar where he was meant to be standing at the center of his own wedding ceremony, walked past his own bride, who was standing frozen in shock, walked past his future mother-in-law who had just committed an act of violence in front of everyone who mattered to his family, and he knelt in the grass beside Sophia, taking her hand in both of his voice low enough that only those closest to them could hear him ask if she was all right, his entire attention and concern focused entirely on her rather than on the ceremony he was meant to be standing at the center of, rather than on the bride, who was watching him from the altar with an expression that cycled between shock and confusion and dawning comprehension. It was Eleanor Hale, the groom's grandmother, seated in the second row of chairs, who made the sound that transformed the moment from a scandal into something else entirely, something far deeper and more complicated than anyone in that garden could have anticipated. She rose from her chair slowly, deliberately, leaning on her cane for stability, and made her way down the aisle with a focus and purpose that seemed to cut through the shock and confusion that had descended on the garden. She moved with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, with the confidence of a woman who had spent decades occupying positions of power and respect, and every eye in that garden followed her progress as she made her way toward Sophia. She stopped directly in front of Sophia and studied her face for a long, careful moment, and then she said a name that meant nothing to Diane Calloway and everything to Sophia, a name that resonated in Sophia's chest like a bell that had been ringing quietly for years and suddenly been struck with force. She said the name of Sophia's mother, said the name of a woman Eleanor had not seen in over 20 years, a name that seemed to transport Sophia backward through time to conversations she had half remembered, stories her mother had told her only in fragments, late at night, followed by requests that Sophia never bring it up again. Eleanor began to speak, her voice trembling but clear, explaining to the assembled crowd that decades earlier, in a time before Sophia was born, before Sophia's mother had ever worked for the Calloway family, Sophia's mother had worked briefly for the Hale family, before a bitter and stupid dispute between Eleanor's late husband and another family member had severed the connection entirely. A dispute that had nothing to do with Sophia's mother's character or her value as a person, and everything to do with Hale family politics and territorial disputes that had cost an innocent woman her position and, in the confusion and conflict that followed, had made it impossible for Eleanor to ever find her again to make things right. Eleanor had spent years afterward trying to locate her, had hired people to search, had kept her eye open in hope of reconnection, wanting desperately to make right a debt she had never stopped carrying, a debt tied to help Sophia's mother had quietly given the Hale family during a crisis that Eleanor never fully explained in that moment, help that had gone unpaid and unacknowledged for over 2 decades, help that Eleanor had never been able to properly repay or properly thank her for. Eleanor had not connected the face standing in front of her to that history, had not made the connection between Sophia and the woman she had been searching for, had not understood until this exact instant why Nathaniel might be kneeling beside this particular woman, why his grandmother might be compelled to leave her seat and walk toward her with such evident emotion. But the recognition, when it came, broke something open in Eleanor's voice, cracked the careful composure she had maintained for decades, and she spoke the truth plainly to everyone who was listening. Sophia was not a stranger who happened to work for the Callaways by random chance. Sophia was not simply another domestic employee performing a role that could have been filled by anyone else. Sophia was the daughter of a woman Eleanor Hale had spent 20 years hoping to find again, hoping to reconnect with, hoping to finally repay a debt of gratitude that had been sitting unpaid for 2 decades. And Sophia was standing in front of her now, in a wedding garden outside Charleston, with a red mark rising on her cheek, struck by the very family that Eleanor's grandson was seconds away from marrying into, struck with violence and rage by a woman who had no understanding of who she was striking or why that action might carry meaning far beyond the immediate moment. The wedding did not stop because of a small wine stain on the hem of a dress. The wedding did not stop because of the slap alone, shocking as that slap had been, humiliating as it had been, unjustifiable as it had been. The wedding stopped because Nathaniel, watching his grandmother's face transform in real time as she recognized Sophia and understood what had just happened, understood immediately the full weight of the moment they were living through, and refused, with absolute certainty, to let the ceremony continue as though nothing had changed, as though this was still simply a wedding with predictable outcomes and traditional trajectories. He refused to stand at an altar and speak vows while a woman he barely knew but whose family had been searching for 2 decades was standing nearby with a handprint on her face, put there by the mother of his bride, put there in front of 200 witnesses, put there as though it meant nothing at all. The garden that had been filled with carefully orchestrated beauty and social performance went silent in a way that suggested something had fundamentally shifted in the basic order of things. Diane Calloway stood frozen at the center of 200 witnesses, forced to confront, in real time, the full shape and weight of what her cruelty had just revealed about her character rather than about Sophia, or her competence, or her reliability. There was no version of this moment that she could smooth over with a practiced smile, no social convention she could invoke that would allow her to pretend this hadn't happened, no amount of careful language or strategic reframing that could undo what 200 people had just witnessed. The story was already being written by those witnesses, the narrative was already being constructed, and Diane had no control over that narrative anymore, because she had surrendered control the moment her hand rose in anger. What had been a performance of flawless social competence and family harmony had transformed in an instant into a demonstration of exactly who Diane Calloway was when she lost her carefully maintained composure. Eleanor did not perform outrage or anger or dramatic recrimination. She did not raise her voice or make sweeping accusations or demand that Diane be removed from the premises or publicly humiliated in return. Instead, she simply turned to face Diane directly and asked her a series of questions in a voice that was quiet, but that seemed to carry more weight than any shouting could have possibly conveyed. She asked whether Diane had any understanding of who she had just struck, whether she had any comprehension of the history she had just become a part of, whether she understood that dignity was not something that could be assigned or denied based on a person's role in someone else's household, whether she grasped that treating a human being this way carried consequences that extended far beyond a single moment of lost temper. Diane's silence in response answered every one of Eleanor's questions more completely than any words she might have offered could have done, a silence that seemed to acknowledge, without her ever having to speak it aloud, that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment, that she had revealed something about herself that she had spent decades trying to hide from view. Grace Calloway crossed the garden with a speed that suggested she had been waiting for permission to act, waiting for someone else to break the spell of social convention first. And when Eleanor had done so, Grace moved to stand beside Sophia, taking her other hand, positioning herself physically between her mother and the woman they had both wronged in different ways over the past months. She offered an apology to Sophia in front of every guest, an apology that was genuine and that broke in her voice in a way that finally, for the first time, matched the years of quiet complicity and silent witnessing she had allowed rather than actively chosen, but that she had failed to resist strongly enough. She told her mother, plainly and clearly, that the wedding would not continue, that no vows would be spoken, that no ceremony would proceed forward until this was made right, that Sophia's dignity and Eleanor's right to the truth about her own family history took priority over Diane's social ambitions and carefully constructed image. It was the first time in Grace's entire life that she had drawn a line her mother could not simply walk around. The first time she had refused to accept her mother's version of events as the definitive version. The first time she had publicly chosen a relationship outside her family over her loyalty to her family itself. Nathaniel remained kneeling beside Sophia for what seemed like a very long time, not speaking, simply being present, his physical position communicating something that words might have undermined or complicated. The rest of the wedding party, the bridesmaids and groomsmen and family members, seemed paralyzed by uncertainty, unsure whether they should attempt to salvage the ceremony or acknowledge that something fundamental had broken and could not be unbroken. The string quartet remained silent, the carefully selected music put on hold, the garden filled with only the sound of wind through the roses and the occasional sob from family members who had begun to understand the true significance of what they had just witnessed. Eleanor moved to a chair nearby and sat down, her focus remaining on Sophia, watching her granddaughter's fiancé with an intensity that suggested she was trying to memorize every detail of this moment, as though she needed to carry the truth of it forward and protect it from being rewritten or minimized or forgotten in the days and weeks to come. Eleanor extended her hand to Sophia, not in a gesture of charity or pity, but in a gesture of genuine connection, asking Sophia if she would be willing to speak with her privately, to hear the full story of what had happened between Eleanor and Sophia's mother, to understand the debt that had never been repaid, to allow Eleanor to finally do the thing she had been wanting to do for 20 years. Sophia looked at Eleanor's face and seemed to see, in that moment, a version of her own mother reflected back at her, seemed to understand that the connection Eleanor was offering was real and genuine and rooted in actual history rather than in guilt or obligation. Sophia nodded, and Eleanor helped her stand, and together they moved away from the garden, away from the 200 guests who were still processing what had happened, away from the altar and the flowers and all of the careful performance, into a private space where the real conversation could finally begin. In the weeks that followed the wedding that didn't happen, the story that emerged from Eleanor's conversations with Sophia transformed everything that everyone thought they understood about Sophia's presence in the Calloway household, about her silence, about her loyalty, about the reason she had flinched whenever Eleanor's name was mentioned. Eleanor explained, in detail, the full history of Sophia's mother's work for the Hale family, the crisis that had occurred, the help that Sophia's mother had provided without asking for compensation or recognition, the way that Eleanor's husband had reacted with fury to Sophia's mother's involvement, the way he had demanded her removal from the household, the way Eleanor had been forced to choose between her marriage and her ability to properly thank and compensate someone who had done something genuinely important for her family. Eleanor had tried to find Sophia's mother in the years that followed, had kept searching even after she married into a different family, even after life had moved in directions she hadn't anticipated. When Sophia's mother passed away, Eleanor learned of it only through a mutual acquaintance, too late to reconnect, too late to thank her, too late to repay the debt that had been sitting unpaid for so long that it had begun to feel impossible to address. But the wedding itself eventually happened, but in a completely different form than anyone had anticipated. Grace and Nathaniel married in a small ceremony, intimate rather than performative, in a setting chosen for meaning rather than image, and Sophia stood beside Grace as an honored guest rather than as staff, a detail that Grace insisted on and that no one objected to after everything that had happened. Diane Calloway attended the ceremony, humbled in a way she had never been humbled before, forced to witness her daughter's life moving forward in directions that Diane did not control, forced to see Sophia not as a servant to be directed, but as a person with her own agency and her own choices and her own future. Diane offered an apology to Sophia, a formal apology, an apology that fell short of undoing years of accumulated harm and small cruelties, but that Sophia accepted anyway, with quiet dignity rather than triumph, because holding on to anger had never been the point for Sophia, because Sophia had learned long ago that carrying resentment was a burden that ultimately weighed down the person carrying it far more than it weighed down the person it was directed at. In the months and years that followed, Sophia built a life that she had imagined during those late nights studying in her small apartment, a life where she controlled her own income, managed her own time, made her own decisions about what she wanted her future to look like. She eventually became a partner in Marcus's firm, bringing her business degree and her understanding of operations and her people skills into a role where they could actually create value, where her contributions were recognized and compensated and valued in the way they had never been valued in the Calloway household. Eleanor remained a mentor and eventually something closer to a friend, a connection that allowed Sophia to understand, finally, something about her mother's own life, something about the choices her mother had made, something about the legacy her mother had been carrying all those years. The final image of Sophia's story is of her standing in an office space with her name on the door, with her brother working beside her, with Eleanor visiting occasionally to check on how things were going. A version of a life that represented not just escape from what had diminished her, but actual achievement and actual success built on her own terms, built with her own hands, built with the intelligence and capability that had always been there, but that had been invisible to everyone except the very few people who had bothered to actually look. The story closes with a reminder that kindness given without expectation of return has a mysterious way of finding its way back, sometimes across decades, sometimes in rooms no one could have predicted, sometimes in the form of someone finally being able to repay a debt that has been sitting unpaid for so long that it has begun to feel like the natural order of things. The story reminds us that a person's true character reveals itself not in moments of comfort and security, but in the exact moment they believe no one who matters is watching, in the choice they make when no one is forcing them to make any particular choice, in the way they treat people they believe are powerless and who they believe can do nothing for them in return. And the story tells us, finally, that sometimes the woman who seems smallest in the room, the woman everyone has trained themselves to overlook, the woman who carries her dignity quietly and asks for nothing, sometimes that woman is actually the strongest person in the room. And sometimes it takes a moment of honest crisis to make that truth finally visible to everyone around her.